he had more time, perhaps he could spend time, on and on, and we would be able to get more detailed information. But already, we could see how complicated the procedure could be. Well, next, Professor Gary Chen. Could you try to make within 10 minutes? Okay.
Hi, I'm Gary from Singapore. Good afternoon to you. I'm very privileged today to be able to. I'm very privileged today to be able to speak to you. Thanks to Professor Koh, Professor Lim, and of course Seoul National University. My topic today is about employment. I think this issue is very ubiquitous, right? In the sense it's everywhere. I guess amongst the audience today, most of you are either subject to some employment decision at some point in your life already, or you might be in a position to make employment decisions, hiring, shortlisting, whatsoever, all right? Or at least contribute to that decision. So to me, this question about employment decision making through the use of AI is very important. So what are the potential benefits first, before we start? Why use AI? If it's a case of, employment decision making on a large scale and on a regular basis, clearly there are benefits in terms of efficiency as well as speed through AI. Second, I think one other advantage is consistency, right? Because humans sometimes, they may not know that they are applying different rules or different criteria for similar cases, right? Maybe memory issues and all that. Third, I think at least at the minimal level, AI will be free from personal bias. I'm not talking about systemic, but personal bias of a human decision maker. All right. So we have talked about other areas of application. I'll just focus on employment. First point is that it can affect many steps within the employment decision. It's already been talked about earlier today, job ads targeting tools, right? For example, the ads targeting tech jobs for males only or primarily. Second, analyzing the CVs. You may receive large amounts of CVs. The AI can help maybe infer the skill sets from the large mass of data. So there's advantage there, right? One example has been developed by IBM Watson, for instance. Matching tools. Here, for matching tools, I'm talking about a scenario before the applicant has submitted anything, right? This is a case where they try to maybe source externally about user interests in jobs and try to match them to suitable companies, right? Even before the user actually even thought of applying for it. Shortlisting tool. Here I'm talking about a situation where application has been submitted, right? And how AI helps to shortlist. And AI can also help in administering pre-employment tests, online ones, to achieve some consistency, right, for everyone. Interviews, even interviews. They may be able to help, although I think this is more rare, it's less common, help in analyzing the candidate behavior. Even there's one that tries to analyze, for example, the emotions. We talked about it this morning, emotions of the candidate. They use chat boxes, for instance, all right? Should we have a human in the loop during the interview? That's another question. Lastly, career coaching. They've used AI to see whether they can help existing employees maybe think about further training, with a view to keeping that, right? Building their career, either within the company. In Singapore recently, there's another use of it. It was reported in the newspapers. A bank has used AI to assess resignation risk. So amongst the employees, whether a particular employee has a higher chance of resigning in the next 6 months or so. So they actually track this. And in fact, with this information, I understand from the report that managers have intervened and persuaded some of them to stay. Okay, first, I'm trying to build a framework here. So I think it's important to first identify the bias. Here, I'm not talking about personal bias, I'm talking about systemic bias rising from AI use. That's the first thing. Second, bias comes because a particular AI use has created advantage for a particular group of persons with certain attributes and disadvantage for another group of persons with different attributes. That alone, it's all right. I don't think there's any problem with that. The third one is unfairness. Right. It can be judged based on disproportionality. Right? Maybe giving more credence to certain groups rather than others without some justification. Or there is no rational nexus, as they say in the law, rational nexus between two different groups where you apply different treatment. Right? Nothing wrong actually with different treatment unless there is a connection because there's a connection based on the differentiator. And we have to identify the harm and adverse effects. I think at a personal level, it will be income livelihood, that's quite clear. And don't forget the dependence of the candidate. Second, at a societal level, if the bias continues and is amplified, then there's a problem with meritocracy, depending how you define meritocracy. And also entrenchment of stereotypes concerning maybe that certain races can't perform certain jobs, which is dangerous. Okay, this is the model. Just to explain this model quickly. First, there is that pre-input bias. So at the time of the job ad, there could already be bias, as I mentioned, right? Job ad targeting. This is the stage of sourcing of candidates, possible candidates, even before they apply. And AI can help in the text of the job advertisements to render it more gender free, less of gender bias rather. And of course the human bias is still there. There's always that human bias. Second, at the input stage, bias of course from the training data. Training data could be from the industry, the sources from industry for instance, or from the employing organization, internal source. Plus of course that particular candidate information or the host of candidate information for that particular job. Third, we have to assess bias from algorithms. And this would be the factors used, the classifiers, as was mentioned earlier, technical bias issues. Right? And here, I think the person that plays an important part will be the software engineers, the designers of the AI. So could there be some human bias there, even though it's technical bias? Lastly, outputs in terms of course hiring as well as shortlisting, for instance. How well the AI predicts. And it gives you a good short list of candidates that you can depend on. Should there be human in the loop in this case? With this framework, we need to look at this societal level. Legal standards, regulatory and ethical guidelines. So of course my focus is more on Singapore. So for Singapore, we have a constitution, of course, with equality provisions. However, there are no cases on employment disputes attacking the constitution, the equality provisions. They tend to be on statutes, whether a statute is valid or not. Right? There are some particular statutes concerning dismissal. You can't dismiss a woman when she's on maternity leave, for instance. You can't dismiss somebody below the retirement age. But by and large, I think Singapore has adopted a softer approach to employment discrimination. Instead of using laws, hard laws, to resolve these issues, they prefer industrial guidelines. Right? They call this the tripartite standards or guidelines, consisting of people from the government, the employers, as well as employees, tripartite. And these guidelines will sort of like encourage employers to adopt good practices, fair practices, right, against discrimination. Next, regulatory standards. You may have heard that Singapore has come up with the new model for AI. That's in January 2019, just this year. And the government agency is Personal Data Protection Commission. And there are two main principles. First, that decision making should be explainable. So the person using the AI should ensure that decision making is explainable, transparent, and fair, because it promotes trust. That's the first big principle. Second, that it must be human-centric. By human-centric, they're not referring to human rights, they're referring to well-being, human well-being. And it promotes trust. And in terms of lower level or more concrete rules, they say that the data sets must ensure accuracy and non-biasness, and there must be a process for review. Lastly, ethical guidelines. So you may refer to some theories. Famous one would be, for example, John Rawls on equality of opportunity, for instance. I also looked at IEEE provisions, which is essentially a certification standard to tackle bias. I.e., if companies want to ensure that they are companies that they are hiring in a non-biased way, then they can adopt these certification standards when they use AI. Interestingly, for these guidelines, they refer to legislative. So you cannot run counter to the legislation in your country. That's one. Second, they focus on stakeholder well-being. So what are some of the possible solutions, which I'll discuss now, according to the different stages? First, I think I'm already mentioning job descriptions, that some of the AI can be used to actually ensure gender-fair language and inclusive wording. This has been talked about a lot, of course. You have to try and ensure comprehensiveness and representativeness of the data, the training data. And by that, I think it has to correlate with the actual use of the data. Right? So for example, is it a global search that you're doing, or is it purely a local search? That will affect your decision as to which training data to source from. One proposal is that data subjects then should have an equal chance of being represented at this initial stage, right? To ensure as much as possible non-bias, or to mitigate the problem of bias. Another possibility is to remove unwanted attributes in the data prior to processing, all right? And this will be in accord with John Rawls, philosopher's idea of veiled ignorance, to hide the data so that the decision made will be fairer. What about the algorithmic stage? Because I mean the algorithm will be looking at the keywords, right? Yeah. And sometimes these keywords have embedded bias in them with gender stereotypes. Another problem is this question of job-related factors, because this will affect the classifiers you use in the algorithm. Is it a straightforward issue? Actually, even without AI, it's not a straightforward issue, because it can be defined in different ways. The most straightforward is to define job-related factors in accordance with the actual job description. What does this job entail, for instance, right? Maybe it's a professional job, it's saying accountancy, and therefore you need that qualifications in accountancy and experience in accountancy. Okay, that's quite clear in most cases. But some other cases will say that this job-related factor should lead to greater likelihood of success in the company itself or in the industry itself, which is something a bit harder to measure, right? And in some cases, it may depend on the fit with the corporate culture. So apart from AI, these are the existing issues anyway. Another proposed solution is to audit the algorithms. Right? But of course, this one incurs a lot of cost. Why would companies have the incentive to do that? There is an American consultancy firm, for instance, right, set up by O'Neill, which tries to apply some of these ethical traits, some constraint factors, with a view to taking care of stakeholder interests, so that these algorithms will be fair. I mentioned already about structured interviews by AI. So I'll skip this part. In terms of output, all right, the AI generates the predictions to shortlist or to hire particular persons. I think there should be a process for review, right? Especially if it's in the earlier stages. Then one thing to note is to be able to store the data so that that can be used for review later, so they can look back at the past decisions. Another more, maybe less common proposal is perhaps to introduce randomness in order to test the algorithms. For example, let's say you use your AI for a certain period and you find that you rank the candidates. Maybe one candidate just scraped through the process, right, using AI, but he turns out to be a top performer in the company, and he's not the only one, maybe there are a few others. Then perhaps you should revisit the algorithm or the process to see whether it has been fair. Have we taken into account some of these cases which succeeded, and maybe should project them and use to review the process, the current process. Okay, ending pretty soon, but of course I cannot miss out on the explainable AI. Okay, the Singapore government position in the AI paper that I spoke about, 2019, they require that there should be some explanation, or they recommend rather, they suggest that there should be some explanation about how the model functions and how it arrives at particular predictions. So it's both general and specific. And of course they mentioned the benefits of trust. So what are the possible ways? One way is for the user to understand the model, the general model, how the input factors translate into the outputs, for instance. Is that good enough? In many instances, that may not be enough because you have a particular guy in front of you, particular decision to make whether to shortlist a person or whether to hire a person. So perhaps an explanation in some of these cases should be more specific. You have to explain the specific decision. For whom? I think it might be sufficient if you are able to explain it to maybe the human resource department, or the CEO has to make the decision. And what does explanation mean? I think it's already been mentioned by Frederick. So in terms of the factors, and I think he also mentioned about the counterfactual causal analysis, right? What if a particular attribute were not there, would you still shortlist that individual? Right? That's one way to explain, counterfactual way, the causal way. The other way from the literature is contrastive explanation. Instead of what if, the question will be why P and not Q? Right? Why this candidate and not the other candidate, especially if P and Q are not very far apart, they are rival candidates. So that might be another explanation. I think the one way to assess it is whether it's intuitive to humans, especially the human resource people, whether they find this explanation intuitive. Just two more slides, limitations. So I think I already mentioned this, that of course there's a background bias. That cannot be solved by AI itself because it's human bias. Transparency and secrecy. What incentive is there to actually disclose, right, for the AI people, AI designers? And I just want to mention there's a US case on that involving Houston Federation of Teachers. Apparently, they use a software, AI software, to make the decision to terminate public teachers on the grounds that the students whom they taught didn't do very well in standardized tests. The value add score was not very high. As a result, they terminated the teachers. Teachers complained, and they succeeded. It was a constitutional issue because the court felt that it was secret, right? And it may be subject to error, but yet the teachers have no way of challenging it. And the result is that their livelihood was deprived of, and therefore the argument succeeded. It's already been mentioned about the different metrics of fairness, so I won't say much more about that. Finally, summary. First, to recognize the existing bias outside of AI itself. It could be human, societal, personal, or even the algorithmic. Second, need a multi-stage approach to look at the different stages where AI bias can impact on employment decision making. There's some talk of a glass box approach, right? i.e. to translate general principles. I think it was talked about in the morning session also. General principles to make it more concrete. That's the first step. And the second step is that the users should continue to monitor and observe to ensure that it actually follows the concrete norms. Thirdly, stakeholders. The impact on stakeholders, designers, the users, i.e. HR department, and the non-users, i.e. the employees and their dependents. Now, of course, I've spoken about the limitations to explainability. Thank you very much for your attention. Thanks.